If you're over 60 and you've been told to watch your blood sugar, there's a good chance somebody already warned you about bread. Maybe it was your doctor. Maybe it was your daughter, standing in your kitchen, quietly moving the white loaf to the back of the pantry. And maybe, if you're honest, you've already tried cutting bread out completely, and it lasted about 4 days before you were back to your morning toast, feeling guilty about it. Here's the truth. Nobody tells you in that 5-minute appointment with your doctor, you don't have to give up bread. Not even close. What you have to give up is the wrong bread. And by the end of this video, you're going to know exactly which loaves are quietly working against you and which ones can actually sit comfortably on your plate, morning after morning, without sending your blood sugar on a roller coaster. Stick around, because bread number 3 on our avoid list is sitting in almost every American refrigerator right now, and it's marketed as the healthy option. Most people never see it coming. My name's on the screen, but you can just think of me as a friend who spent a long time digging through nutrition research so you don't have to. Welcome to Prime Health Insights, the channel where we take the confusing stuff about food, aging, and blood sugar and turn it into simple, real-world advice you can actually use tonight at the dinner table. If that sounds like something you need in your life, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now before we even get started, because we've got a whole library of videos like this one waiting for you, and you don't want to miss the next one. It takes 2 seconds, it's free, and it means the world to a small channel like ours. Think about your own kitchen for a second. How many times have you stood in the bread aisle, staring at a wall of loaves that all claim to be hearty, healthy, or made with whole grains, and just picked one based on a gut feeling because you didn't have 20 minutes to read every label? You're not alone in that. The grocery store is designed to make that decision harder than it needs to be, with clever wording and eye-catching packaging that leans on words like multigrain and wheat without actually telling you what's inside. Part of what we're doing today is giving you a simple mental checklist so that the next time you're standing in that aisle, you're not guessing you know exactly what to look for and what to walk right past. All right, let's get into it. Here's why bread specifically becomes such a big deal after 60. As we age, our bodies naturally become a little less efficient at handling insulin. That's not a personal failing, it's just biology, a normal part of getting older, the same way your eyesight or your joints change over time. For someone managing diabetes, or even prediabetes, that means the body has a harder time controlling how quickly sugar from food enters the bloodstream. And bread, because it's made from grain, is essentially a vehicle for carbohydrates. Some breads release that sugar into your blood, nice and slow, giving your body time to keep up. Others dump it in fast, like opening a floodgate, and that's when you get those spikes and crashes that leave you tired, foggy, and reaching for something sweet an hour later. The difference between a good bread and a bad bread usually comes down to 3 things: how much fiber it has, how processed the flour is, and what else is riding along with it: sugar, seeds, whole grains, or a bunch of preservatives you can't pronounce. Fiber is really the hero of this whole story. It slows down digestion, it feeds the good bacteria in your gut, and it acts almost like a buffer between the starch in the bread and your bloodstream. The more intact and whole a grain is, the more of that natural fiber survives into the final loaf. The more a grain gets stripped down, bleached, and ground into a fine powder, the less protection you get, and the faster that bread turns into pure sugar once it hits your system. So with that in mind, let's start with the breads that deserve a spot in your kitchen. And I want you to really pay attention to number 1, because it might not be the bread you're expecting. Number 1, sprouted whole grain bread. You'll often see this on the shelf labeled as Ezekiel-style bread or sprouted grain bread, usually sitting in the freezer section rather than the regular bread aisle, and that's actually a clue that it's made differently than the loaves around it. This bread is made from whole grains and sometimes legumes that have been allowed to sprout before they're milled. Sprouting essentially wakes the grain up. It starts breaking down some of the starches naturally, before the bread is even baked, which means your body doesn't have to work as hard to digest it later. It also tends to boost the availability of certain nutrients like folate, vitamin C, and various minerals that are useful for people managing blood sugar and heart health, both of which become bigger priorities the older we get. Because it's made from the whole intact grain rather than refined flour, it holds onto its fiber, and that fiber does exactly what we talked about. It slows things down. Texture-wise, sprouted grain bread tends to be denser and a little heartier than a fluffy white or wheat loaf. Some people need a moment to get used to that, but most come to genuinely prefer it, especially once they notice they're not getting that mid-morning energy crash anymore. If you're new to it, try it lightly, toasted with a bit of avocado or a spoon of natural peanut butter. The fat and protein from the topping slow digestion down even further, which is a trick we'll come back to later in this video. Number 2, genuine sourdough bread. And I want to stress the word genuine here, because a lot of what's labeled sourdough in a regular grocery store is not made the traditional way. Real sourdough is made through a slow fermentation process using a natural culture of wild yeast and bacteria rather than the fast-acting commercial yeast used in most breads. That long, slow fermentation actually changes the structure of the starches in the flour before it's ever baked. Studies going back decades have consistently shown that properly fermented sourdough tends to produce a gentler rise in blood sugar compared to bread made with commercial yeast and no fermentation time, even when the flour itself is fairly similar. The fermentation process also breaks down some of the compounds in wheat that can be harder to digest, which is part of why some people who feel bloated after regular bread do just fine with true sourdough. The catch is, you want to look for a loaf that lists a long ingredient, something like flour, water, salt, and a sourdough starter or culture rather than a short ingredient list with added commercial yeast and dough conditioners just wearing a sourdough label for marketing. A local bakery is often your best bet here, or reading that ingredient panel very carefully at the store. Number 3, dense rye bread, especially the darker, denser varieties like pumpernickel or traditional German-style rye. Rye flour behaves differently in the body than wheat flour. It has a different type of fiber structure, and dense rye breads in particular tend to have a noticeably gentler effect on blood sugar than a typical wheat loaf of the same size. Part of this comes down to the density itself, because these breads are heavier and more compact. You naturally end up eating a smaller portion by volume, and that smaller portion carries less impact. Rye is also a good source of magnesium, a mineral that plays a role in how your body manages insulin, and one that a lot of older adults don't get quite enough of through their regular diet. If you've never tried a dark rye before, know that the flavor is bolder and slightly tangy compared to what you might be used to. It pairs beautifully with smoked salmon, a slice of turkey, or simply a bit of butter and a soft-boiled egg on the side, a combination that, again, blends protein and fat with the bread to keep digestion slow and steady. Number 4, 100% whole wheat bread, but only the real thing. This is where a lot of people get tripped up at the grocery store, because wheat bread and 100% whole wheat bread sound almost identical, but they can be worlds apart nutritionally. Standard wheat bread is often made mostly from refined white flour with a small amount of whole wheat flour added, plus caramel coloring to make it look darker and healthier than it actually is. True 100% whole wheat bread uses the entire wheat kernel, the bran, the germ, and the endosperm all ground together, which keeps the fiber and nutrients intact. When you're shopping, the very first ingredient listed needs to say 100% whole wheat flour, not just wheat flour, and not enriched flour. That single word difference on the label is the difference between a bread that supports steady blood sugar and one that behaves almost identically to white bread once it's in your body. A genuine whole wheat loaf gives you a solid 3 to 4 grams of fiber per slice in many cases, along with a decent amount of B vitamins that support energy and nerve health, both of which matter more as we get older. Number 5, seeded and flax-enriched breads, meaning whole grain loaves that have flaxseed, chia seeds, sunflower seeds, or a mix of seeds baked right into the dough or pressed onto the crust. These seeds add an extra layer of fiber and healthy fats on top of whatever benefits the base bread already offers. Flaxseed in particular is worth calling out because it's one of the better plant sources of omega-3 fatty acids, which have a long-standing reputation for supporting heart health and for adults over 60 managing diabetes. Heart health and blood sugar management really do go hand in hand, since diabetes raises cardiovascular risk over time. The seeds also add a satisfying crunch and a bit of natural texture that can make a slice of bread feel more like a full, satisfying part of a meal rather than just an empty carbohydrate sitting next to your eggs. Now, quick pause here, because I want to ask you something in the comments below. Out of those 5 breads we just covered, sprouted grain, true sourdough, dark rye, real whole wheat, or a seeded loaf, which one is already sitting in your kitchen right now, and which one are you going to try this week? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and honestly, it helps this channel grow when the comment section is active, so don't be shy. Before we move to the 3 breads you genuinely want to avoid, I want to give you a couple of quick habits that make almost any decent bread even gentler on your blood sugar. First, pairing matters. Bread eaten alone, on an empty stomach, tends to spike blood sugar faster than bread eaten alongside protein, fiber, or healthy fat. That's why a slice of toast with just jam behaves very differently in your body than that same slice with a couple of eggs and some avocado next to it. Second, portion and thickness matter more than people expect. A thin slice from a dense, hearty loaf is often a smarter choice than a thick, fluffy slice from a lighter bread, simply because you're getting less total starch per bite. And third, temperature and freshness play a role too. Bread that's been allowed to cool completely, or even lightly toasted, can behave slightly differently than warm, fresh from the oven bread, because some of the starch structure changes as it cools, which can modestly slow digestion. None of these tricks turn a bad bread into a good one, but they can absolutely make a good bread even more forgiving. All right, now let's talk about the 3 breads that deserve to stay out of your cart, starting with the one most people already suspect, and ending with the one that catches almost everyone off guard. The first bread to avoid is standard white bread. I know you probably already expected this one, but I want to explain exactly why it behaves the way it does in your body, because understanding the why is what actually helps you stick to better choices long term. White bread is made from flour that's had the bran and the germs stripped away, leaving mostly the starchy endosperm behind. That process removes the vast majority of the natural fiber, along with a good portion of the vitamins and minerals that would otherwise be there. What's left is essentially a fast-digesting starch that your body converts to sugar very quickly. For someone whose insulin response is already working overtime, that fast conversion can mean a sharp rise in blood sugar shortly after eating, followed by that familiar crash and craving for something else, starchy or sweet an hour or two later. It's a cycle that's hard to break once it gets going, and white bread is often sitting right at the center of it. The second bread to avoid is deceptive multigrain or honey wheat bread, and this is the one I mentioned earlier that trips up more people than you'd think because it's marketed to look like a healthy choice. The word multigrain only means the bread contains more than one type of grain. It says absolutely nothing about whether those grains are whole or refined. A lot of multigrain loaves are made primarily from the same refined white flour as a standard white bread, with a small amount of visible seeds, oats, or grains sprinkled on top or mixed in mostly for appearance and marketing. Honey wheat bread has a similar issue. The addition of honey or brown sugar for flavor and color means you're often getting the downsides of refined flour plus an extra dose of added sugar on top of it. The fix here is simple, but requires actually reading the label rather than trusting the front of the package. Flip the loaf over and check that the very first ingredient is a whole grain flour, and look at the sugar content per slice. If sugar or honey shows up in the first few ingredients, or if the fiber content is under 2 or 3 grams per slice, that healthy-looking loaf is probably behaving a lot more like white bread than you'd expect from the packaging. The third bread to avoid is highly processed, gluten-free bread made primarily from refined starches like white rice flour, tapioca starch, or potato starch. Now, I want to be careful here, because gluten-free bread is genuinely necessary for people with celiac disease or a real gluten sensitivity, and that's a completely different conversation. But for someone who doesn't have a medical need to avoid gluten and is choosing gluten-free bread simply because it sounds healthier, this can actually backfire. Many gluten-free breads on store shelves use refined starches as their base specifically because those starches are cheap and easy to work with, and they tend to have very little fiber and a fast, sharp effect on blood sugar, in some cases behaving even more aggressively than a regular white bread would. If gluten-free is a genuine medical necessity for you, the better approach is looking specifically for gluten-free breads built around whole grain alternatives like whole grain buckwheat, whole grain sorghum, or a blend that includes seeds and legume flours, rather than one built purely from refined white rice flour and starch. Before we wrap up the avoid list, let's clear up a couple of myths that tend to float around online, because I know some of you have probably heard these repeated in Facebook groups or from well-meaning neighbors. The first myth is that brown color automatically means a bread is whole grain. It doesn't. Food manufacturers can add caramel coloring or molasses to a loaf made almost entirely from refined white flour, and the result looks exactly like a hearty whole grain bread on the outside while behaving like white bread on the inside. Color is not a reliable clue, the ingredient list is. The second myth is that all carbohydrates are the enemy and bread should be avoided completely if you're managing diabetes. That's simply not supported by how the body actually works. Carbohydrates are a normal, necessary part of a balanced diet, even for someone with diabetes. The goal was never to eliminate them, it's to choose the ones that release their energy slowly and to eat them in sensible portions alongside protein and fiber. Cutting out bread entirely often backfires anyway, because it tends to lead to feelings of deprivation, which for a lot of people ends in a much bigger binge on exactly the wrong kind of bread a few weeks later. A slow, steady, sustainable approach almost always beats an all-or-nothing one, especially once you're past 60 and your relationship with food has had decades to settle into certain habits. There's also a practical, everyday piece of this that's worth mentioning where you buy your bread matters almost as much as which bread you buy. A loaf that's been sitting on a shelf for weeks, packed with preservatives to extend its shelf life, is a very different product from a fresh loaf picked up from a local bakery or the in-store bakery section of your grocery store, even if the ingredient list looks somewhat similar on paper. Fresh-baked whole grain and sourdough loaves often use simpler, shorter ingredient lists because they're not designed to sit in a warehouse for months before reaching your table. If you have a local bakery nearby, it's worth asking them directly how they make their sourdough or whole grain loaves. Many small bakeries are happy to talk through their process, and you'll often find they're using traditional methods that line up closely with everything we've covered today. One more practical tip before we move on. Freezing bread in individual slices is a smart habit for anyone managing diabetes, especially if you live alone or you're the only one in the house eating a particular loaf. Buying a proper whole grain or sourdough bread, slicing it, and freezing portions means you're never tempted to reach for a quicker, less healthy option just because the good bread went stale on the counter before you finished it. Pull a slice out, let it thaw or toast it straight from frozen, and you get the same benefits without the waste. So to recap where that leaves us: sprouted grain bread, true sourdough, dense rye, genuine 100% whole wheat, and seeded whole grain loaves are your friends. White bread, deceptively labeled multigrain or honey wheat bread, and refined starch-based gluten-free bread are the ones quietly working against your blood sugar, even when the packaging tries to tell you otherwise. I do want to say clearly, this video is meant to give you the kind of general nutrition understanding that helps you make smarter choices at the grocery store, but it isn't a substitute for the personalized guidance of your doctor or a registered dietitian, especially if you're on specific diabetes medication where meal timing and carbohydrate intake need to be managed carefully. If anything in this video raised a question about your own situation, that's a great thing to bring up at your next appointment. If this video actually helped clear something up for you, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps other people over 60 find this same information when they're standing in the bread aisle feeling just as confused as you might have felt before watching this. And if you know someone, a parent, a spouse, a friend, who's been struggling to figure out what bread is actually safe for them, go ahead and share this video with them directly. Sometimes the most helpful thing you can do for someone you care about is send them 5 minutes of clear information instead of a lecture. Before you go, I'd genuinely love to know, has a doctor or a family member ever warned you off bread completely? And did you actually follow that advice? Or did you find a way to make it work like we talked about today? Tell me your story in the comments below. I read through them, I reply when I can, and honestly, some of the best topics for future videos on this channel come directly from what you all share down there. And if you haven't already, now's the perfect time to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we're building out a whole series here on Prime Health Insights specifically for adults over 60 who want real, practical answers about food, blood sugar, heart health, and healthy aging without the confusing jargon and without being talked down to. We've got more videos like this one coming soon, and you genuinely don't want to miss them. One last thing before I let you go: a quick, simple checklist you can screenshot or write down and keep on your phone for your next grocery run. First, check that the very first ingredient is a whole grain, not just wheat flour or enriched flour. Second, look for at least 3 grams of fiber per slice and ideally closer to 4 or 5. Third, check the sugar content and try to stay under 2 or 3 grams per slice, since anything higher usually means honey, molasses, or added sugar has been mixed in. Fourth, don't be fooled by color or words like multigrain, natural, or artisan. Printed on the front, those words aren't regulated the way you'd hope, and the only place the truth lives is on the ingredient panel on the back. And fifth, when in doubt, a short ingredient list almost always beats a long one. If you can't pronounce half of what's in your bread, your body is going to have just as hard a time processing it as you did reading it. Thanks so much for spending this time with me today. Take care of yourself, make one small smarter swap the next time you're at the store, and I'll see you in the next video.